Ahoy and welcome to the Salty Dog, a special segment of the Catholic Men's Podcast, where we tell many a yarn for youngsters. Grab your grog, and we can begin. Tom Sawyer Abroad by Mark Twain. Chapter 3. Tom Explains. We went to sleep about 4 o'clock and woke up about 8. The professor was sitting back there at his end looking glum. He pitched us some breakfast, but he told us not to come abaft the midship compass. That was about the middle of the boat. Well, when you're sharp set and you eat and satisfy yourself, everything looks pretty different from what it done before. It makes a body feel pretty near comfortable, even when he's up in a balloon with a genius. We got to talking together. There was one thing that kept bothering me, and by I says, "Tom, didn't we start east?" "Yes." "How fast have we been going?" "Well, you heard what the professor said when he was raging round. Sometimes he said we was making 50 miles an hour, sometimes 90, sometimes 100. Said that with a gale to help, he could make 300 any time, and said if he wanted the gale and wanted it blowing the right direction, he had only to go up higher or down lower to find it." "Well, then it's just as I reckoned. The professor lied." "Why?" "Because if he was going so fast, we ought to be past Illinois, oughtn't we?" "Certainly." "Well, we ain't." "What's the reason we ain't?" "I know by the color. We're right over Illinois yet, and you can see for yourself that Indiana ain't in sight." "I wonder what's the matter with you, Huck. You know by the color?" "Yes, of course I do. What's the color got to do with it?" "It's got everything to do with it. Illinois is green. Indiana is pink. You show me any pink down here if you can." "No, sir, it's green." "Indiana pink? Why, what a lie." "It ain't no lie. I've seen it on the map, and it's pink." You never see a person so aggravated and disgusted. He says, "Well, if I was such a numbskull as you, Huck Finn, I would jump over. Seen it on the map? Huck Finn, did you reckon the states was the same color out of doors as they are on the map?" "Tom Sawyer, what's a map for? Ain't it to learn your facts?" "Of course." "Well, then how's it going to do that if it tells lies? That's what I want to know." "Shucks, you muggins, it don't tell lies." "It don't it?" "No, it don't." "All right, then. If it don't, there ain't no two states the same color. You get around that if you can, Tom Sawyer." He see I had him, and Jim see it too, and I tell you it felt pretty good, for Tom Sawyer was always a hard person to get ahead of. Jim slapped his leg and says, "I tell you that's smart. That's right down smart. Ain't no use, Mars Tom. He got you this time, sure." He slapped his leg again and says, "My land, but it was a smart one." I never felt so good in my life. I've often thought of that time, and I can remember just the way everything looked, same as if it was only last week. I can see it all, beautiful rolling country with woods and fields and lakes for hundreds and hundreds of miles all around, and towns and villages scattered everywhere under us, here and there and yonder, and the professor mooning over a chart on his little table, and Tom's cap flopping in the rigging where it was hung up to dry, and one thing in particular was a bird right alongside, not 10 foot off, going our way and trying to keep up, but losing ground all the time, and a railroad train doing the same thing down there, sliding among the trees and farms and pouring out a long cloud of black smoke and now and then a little puff of white. And when the white was gone so long you'd almost forgot it, you would hear a little faint toot, and that was the whistle. And we left the bird and the train both behind, way behind, and done it easy, too. But Tom, he was huffy, and said me and Jim was a couple of ignorant blatherskites. He says, "Suppose there's a brown calf and a big brown dog, and an artist is making a picture of them. What's the main thing that the artist has got to do? He's got to paint them so you can tell them both apart the minute you look at them, ain't he?" "Of course." "Well, then, do you want him to go and paint both of them brown?" "Certainly you don't. He paints one of them blue, and then you can't make no mistake. It's just the same with the maps. That's why they make every state a different color. It ain't to deceive you, it's to keep you from deceiving yourself." But I couldn't see no argument about that, and neither could Jim. He shook his head and says, "Why, Mars Tom, if you knowed what chuckleheads dem painters is, you'd wait a long time before you'd fetch one of them in to back up a fact. I's gwine tell you, then you can see for yourself. I see one of 'em a-painting away one day down in old Hank Wilson's back lot, and I went down to see, and he was painting that old brindle cow with her near horn gone. You knows the one I means. And I asked him what he's a-painting her for, and he said when he get her painted, the picture's worth $100. Well, Mars Tom, he could 'a' got the cow for 15, and I told him so. Well, sir, if you'll believe me, he just shook his head, that painter did, and went on a-dobbin'. Bless you, Mars Tom, they don't know nothing." Tom lost his temper. I notice a person most always does that got laid out in an argument. He told us to shut up and maybe we'd feel better. Then he see a town clock away off down yonder, and he took up the glass and looked at it, and then looked at a silver turnip, then at the clock, then at the silver turnip again, and says, "That's funny. That clock's about an hour fast." So he put up his turnip. Then he see another clock and took a look, and it was an hour fast too. That puzzled him. "That's a mighty curious thing," he says. "I don't understand it." Then he took the glass and hunted up another clock, and sure enough it was an hour fast too. Then his eyes began to spread and his breath to come out kind of gaspy-like, and he says, "Great Scott, it's the longitude." I says, considerably scared, "Well, what's been and gone and happened now?" "Why, the thing that's happened is that this old bladder has slid over Illinois and Indiana and Ohio like nothing, and this is the east end of Pennsylvania or New York or somewheres around there." "Tom Sawyer, you don't mean it." "Yes, I do, and it's dead sure. We've covered about 15 degrees of longitude since we left St. Louis yesterday afternoon, and them clocks are right. We've come close on to 800 miles. I didn't believe it, but it made the cold streaks trickle down my back just the same. In my experience, I knowed it wouldn't take much short of 2 weeks to do it down the Mississippi on a raft. Jim was working his mind and studying. Pretty soon he says, "Mars Tom, did you say them clocks is right?" "Yes, they're right." "Ain't your watch right too?" "She's right for St. Louis, but she's an hour wrong for here." "Mars Tom, is you trying to let on that time ain't the same everywheres?" "No, it ain't the same everywheres by a long shot." Jim looked distressed and says, "It grieves me to hear you talk like that, Mars Tom. I's right down ashamed to hear you talk like that, out of the way you's been raised. Yasser, it'd break your Aunt Polly's heart to hear you." Tom was astonished. He looked Jim over, wondering, and didn't say nothing, and Jim went on. "Mars Tom, who put the people out yonder in St. Louis? The Lord done it. Who put the people here whar we is? The Lord done it. Ain't they both his children? Course they is. Well then, is he gwine to discriminate twixt them? Discriminate? This case here ain't no discrimination of his. It's man's. The Lord made the day, and he made the night, but he didn't invent the hours, and he didn't distribute them around. Man did that." "Mars Tom, is that so? Man done it?" "Certainly." "Who told him he could?" "Nobody. He never asked." Jim studied a minute and says, "Well, that do beat me. I wouldn't have tuck no such risk. But some people ain't scared of nothing. They bangs right ahead. They don't care what happens. So then there's hours and hours of difference everywhere, Mars Tom?" "An hour? No, it's 4 minutes difference to every degree of longitude, you know. 15 of 'em's an hour, 30 of 'em's 2 hours, and so on. When it's 1 o'clock Tuesday morning in England, it's 8 o'clock the night before in New York." Jim moved a little way along the locker, and you could see he was insulted. He kept shaking his head and muttering, and so I slid along to him and patted him on the leg and petted him up and got him over the worst of his feelings. Then he says, "Mars Tom, talking such talk as that. Tuesday in one place and Monday in t'other, both in the exact same day? Huck, this ain't no place to joke up here where we is. 2 days in 1 day. How's you gwine to get 2 days into 1 day? Can't get 2 hours into 1 hour, can you? Can't get 2 gallons of whiskey into a 1-gallon jug, can you? No, sir. 'Twould strain the jug. Yes, even then you couldn't. I don't believe. Well, looky here, Huck. Supposin' the Tuesday was New Year's. Now den, is you gwine tell me it's this year in one place and last year in t'other, both in the identical same minute? It's the beatin'est rubbage. I can't stand it. I can't stand to hear tell about it. Then he begun to shiver and turn gray, and Tom says, Now what's the matter? What's the trouble? Jim could hardly speak, but he says, Moss Tom, you ain't joking, and it's so? No, I'm not, and it is so. Jim shivered again and says, Then that Monday could be the last day, and there wouldn't be no last day in England, and the dead wouldn't be called. You mustn't go over there, Moss Tom. Please get him to turn back. I wants to be where... All of a sudden we see something, and all jumped up and forgot everything and begun to gaze. Tom says, Ain't that the... He catched his breath and says, It is, sure as you live, it's the ocean. That made me and Jim catch our breath too. Then we all stood petrified but happy, for none of us had ever seen an ocean or ever expected to. Tom kept muttering, Atlantic Ocean, Atlantic. Land, don't it sound great? And that's it. And we're looking at it. We. Why, it's just too splendid to believe. Then we see a big bank of black smoke, and when we got nearer it was a city, and a monster she was too, with a thick fringe of ships around one edge, and we wondered if it was New York, and begun to jaw and dispute about it, and first we knowed it slid from under us and went flying behind, and here we was out over the very ocean itself, and going like a cyclone. Then we woke up, I tell you. We made a break aft and raised a wail and begun to beg the professor to turn back and land us, but he jerked out his pistol and motioned us back, and we went, but nobody will ever know how bad we felt. The land was gone, all but a little streak, like a snake, away off in the edge of the water, and down under us was just ocean, 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 millions of miles of it, heaving and pitching and squirming and white sprays blowing from the wave tops, and only a few ships in sight, wallowing around and laying over, first on one side, then on t'other, and sticking their bows under and then their sterns, and before long there weren't no ships at all, and we had the sky and the whole ocean all to ourselves, and the roomiest place I ever see, and the lonesomest. Chapter 4. Storm. And it got lonesomer and lonesomer. There was the big sky up there, empty and awful deep, and the ocean down there without a thing on it but just the waves. All around us was a ring, where the sky and the water come together. Yes, a monstrous big ring it was, and we right in the dead center of it, plumb in the center. We was racing along like a prairie fire, but it never made any difference. We couldn't seem to get past that center no way. I couldn't see that we ever gained an inch on that ring. It made a body feel creepy. It was so curious and unaccountable. Well, everything was so awful still that we got to talking in a very low voice and kept on getting creepier and lonesomer and less talky till at last the talk ran dry altogether, and we just sat there and thunk, as Jim calls it, and never said a word the longest time. The professor never stirred till the sun was overhead. Then he stood up and put a kind of triangle to his eye, and Tom said it was a sextant, and he was taking the sun to see whereabouts the balloon was. Then he ciphered a little and looked in a book, and then he began to carry on again. He said lots of wild things, and among others, he said he would keep us in this 100-mile gait till the middle of tomorrow afternoon, and then he'd land in London. We said we'd be most humbly thankful. He was turning away, but he whirled around when we said that, and give us a long look of his blackest kind, one of the maliciousest and suspiciousest looks I ever see. Then he says, You want to leave me. Don't try to deny it. We didn't know what to say, so we held in and didn't say nothing at all. He went aft and sat down, but he couldn't seem to get that thing out of his mind. Every now and then he would rip out something about it and try to make us answer him, but we dasn't. It got lonesomer and lonesomer right along, and it did seem to me I couldn't stand it. By and by, Tom pinched me and whispers, Look! I took a glance aft, and see the professor taking a wet out of a bottle. I didn't like the looks of that. By and by he took another drink, and pretty soon he begun to sing. It was dark now and getting black and stormy. He went on singing wilder and wilder, and the thunder began to mutter and the wind to wheeze and moan among the ropes, and altogether it was awful. It got so black we couldn't see him any more, and wished we couldn't hear him, but we could. Then he got still, but he weren't still 10 minutes till we got suspicious and wished he would start up his noise again, so we could tell where he was. By and by there was a flash of lightning, and we see him start to get up, but he staggered and fell down. We heard him scream out in the dark, "They don't want to go to England. All right, I'll change the course. They want to leave me. I know they do. Well, they shall. And now." I most died when he said that. Then he was still again, still so long I couldn't bear it, and it did seem to me the lightning wouldn't ever come again. But at last there was a blessed flash, and there he was on his hands and knees, crawling, not 4 feet from us. My, but his eyes was terrible. He made a lunge for Tom and says, "Overboard you go," but it was already pitch dark again, and I couldn't see whether he got him or not, and Tom didn't make a sound. There was another long, horrible wait, and then there was a flash, and I see Tom's head sink down outside the boat and disappear. He was on the rope ladder that dangled down in the air from the gunwale. The professor let off a shout and jumped for him, and straight off it was pitch dark again, and Jim groaned out, "Po, Moss Tom, he's a-gonna," and made a jump for the professor, but the professor warn't there. Then we heard a couple of terrible screams, and then another not so loud, and then another that was way below, and you could only just hear it, and I heard Jim say, "Po, Moss Tom." Then it was awful still, and I reckon a person could have counted 4,000 before the next flash come. When it come, I see Jim on his knees, with his arms on the locker and his face buried in them, and he was crying. Before I could look over the edge, it was all dark again, and I was glad, because I didn't want to see. But when the next flash come, I was watching, and down there I see somebody a-swinging in the wind on the ladder, and it was Tom. "Come up," I shouts. "Come up, Tom." His voice was so weak, and the wind roared so I couldn't make out what he said, but I thought he asked was the professor up there. I shouts, "No, he's down in the ocean. Come up, can we help you?" Of course, all this in the dark. "Huck, who's you hollerin' at?" "I'm hollerin' at Tom." "Oh, Huck, how can you act so when you know poor Moss Tom?" Then he let off an awful scream and flung his head and arms back and let off another one because there was a white glare just then, and he had raised up his face just in time to see Tom's, as white as snow, rise above the gunwale and look him right in the eye. He thought it was Tom's ghost, you see. Tom clumb aboard, and when Jim found it was him and not his ghost, he hugged him and called him all sorts of loving names and carried on like he was gone crazy, he was so glad. Says I, "What did you wait for, Tom? Why didn't you come up at first?" "I dasn't, Huck. I knowed somebody plunged down past me, but I didn't know who it was in the dark. Could have been you, could have been Jim." That was the way with Tom Sawyer, always sound. He weren't coming up till he knowed where the professor was. The storm let go about this time with all its might, and it was dreadful the way the thunder boomed and tore, and the lightning glared out, and the wind sung and screamed in the rigging, and the rain come down. One second you couldn't see your hand before you, and the next you could count the threads in your coat sleeve and see a whole wide desert of waves pitching and tossing through a kind of veil of rain. A storm like that's the loveliest thing there is, but it ain't at its best when you're up in the sky and lost, and it's wet and lonesome, and there's just been a death in the family. We sat there huddled up in the bow and talked low about the poor professor, and everybody was sorry for him and sorry the world had made fun of him and treated him so harsh when he was doing the best he could and hadn't a friend nor nobody to encourage him and keep him from brooding his mind away and going deranged. There was plenty of clothes and blankets and everything at the other end, but we thought we'd rather take the rain than go meddling back there. End of Part 2 of Tom Sawyer Abroad. I think we'll take a break from Tom Sawyer Abroad for a while, and we'll cover some other things. So until next time, I wish you fair winds and following seas. Godspeed.